Let me ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not to me, but to yourself. If I told you that there are 4 business models inside the Bible, 4 paths that have survived entire empires, that have endured wars, crises, famine, and economic collapse, and that still work today in the United States with less than $100, would you believe me? Or have you already been conditioned to think that the Bible has nothing to say about money, that God doesn't care about work, that prosperity is something distant, almost forbidden? Because that's the big lie a lot of people have believed. They turned the Bible into a purely spiritual book and forgot that it is also a manual for real life, a guide for the real world, for real work, for real money. Pay attention to this number. There are more than 2,300 verses in the Bible about money, work, wealth, stewardship, and resources, more than about prayer, more than about faith on its own. That's not a coincidence. That's direction. And today, you're going to see 4 paths, 4 kinds of work, 4 pillars that God revealed from the very beginning of humanity. And maybe, just maybe, this is exactly what you needed to hear to break out of stagnation. But before we go any further, I need to break something inside of you. Because if you came here expecting a promise of easy money, you're in the wrong place. I'm not going to tell you that if you just pray, everything will fall into place. I'm not here to sell you an illusion, because that's not the gospel. That's deception. And the Bible condemns it. God doesn't work through magic. God works through principles, through discipline, through obedience, through consistency. Ecclesiastes 9:11 says something most people don't want to hear. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but time and chance happen to them all. In other words, you can do everything right and still face difficulties. That's real. That's honest. And I'd rather tell you that now than leave you with false expectations. But here's the point that changes everything. When you ignore God's principles, failure stops being a possibility and becomes a consequence. Now listen to this carefully. In Matthew 25, Jesus tells the parable of the talents. A master goes on a journey and entrusts resources to 3 servants, 5 talents to one, 2 to another, 1 to the last. And pay attention to what happens. The first 2 didn't wait for the perfect moment. They didn't get stuck in overthinking. They didn't let fear control them. They acted, and they multiplied what they were given. And they heard the most powerful words a servant could hear from his master. "Well done, good and faithful servant." But the third one did something a lot of people are doing today. He buried it. He didn't lose the money. He didn't do anything wrong in the eyes of people. He just did nothing. He kept it. He waited. He stayed still. And Jesus himself, calls this man what? A wicked and lazy servant. Do you understand the weight of that? The problem wasn't failure. The problem was not trying. It was wasted potential. It was burying what God placed in his hands. And how many people today are exactly in that place? Full of ability, full of ideas, full of potential, but paralyzed, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for total security, waiting for a sign from heaven. But let me tell you something that will change the way you think starting today. What God has already placed in your hands was the sign. And now that you understand that, I'm going to show you the 4 kinds of work the Bible reveals. 4 real paths, 4 ways to multiply what you already have. And the first one might surprise you. Agriculture and food, producer/cook. Now let's move to the first kind of work. And I need you to remove right now any bias you may have about what I'm about to say. Because when most people hear the word agriculture, they think of something distant, something outdated, something that has nothing to do with modern life, with big cities, with the digital world. But what if I told you this is actually the oldest business model in the world, and still the most necessary one? Think about it. What is the one thing human beings will never stop needing? Food. It doesn't matter the crisis. It doesn't matter the recession. It doesn't matter the economic collapse. People will always need to eat, and anyone who produces, transforms, or distributes food will never be without a market. This is not a modern marketing strategy. This is a principle that God established before the fall of man. In Genesis 2:15, before sin, before pain, before anything went wrong, it says, "The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it." Read that again with new eyes. God didn't place man in the garden to rest. He didn't place him there to simply observe. He placed him there to work and to keep it. Work and responsibility. Production and stewardship. That was humanity's first calling. Before organized religion, before temples, before any social structure. The first job in human history was agriculture, and it wasn't an accident. It was divine design. Now move forward in Scripture to Proverbs 12:11. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, writes with sharp clarity, "Whoever works his land will have abundant food, but whoever chases fantasies lacks sense." Pay attention to the structure of that verse. It doesn't say might have abundance. It says will have. This is a promise connected to action, a cause and effect principle woven into creation itself. And notice the second part. Solomon doesn't soften his words. The one who chases empty things, shortcuts, or avoids real work is called someone who lacks understanding. That's not just laziness. That's a lack of wisdom. Now let me expand this for you, because when we talk about agriculture and food, we're not just talking about planting in the ground. We're talking about an entire ecosystem that goes from the field to the table. Think about the farmer who sells directly to consumers. Think about small growers supplying local markets. Think about the woman who turns simple ingredients into homemade meals to sell. Think about the baker starting in their own kitchen. Think about the entrepreneur who buys raw goods and resells them processed. All of these are modern expressions of the same biblical principle: to cultivate and to keep, to produce and to manage. And here's what makes this even more powerful. This kind of work requires almost no advanced technology. You don't need a high-end computer. You don't need an office. You don't need a college degree. You need soil or a kitchen, ingredients, time, and commitment. In the United States, for example, there are people who started selling homemade products at local farmers markets with less than $100 and built six-figure businesses within a few years. Not because they invented something new, but because they applied a principle that has been proven for thousands of years. But let me ask you something, and this might make you uncomfortable. If this kind of work is so solid, if it's in the Bible, if it has worked for centuries, why do so few people choose it? The answer is simple and painful at the same time, because it requires patience. A seed does not grow overnight. Bread doesn't come out of the oven in 5 minutes. A garden doesn't produce profit in the first week. And we are living in a generation that has been trained to expect immediate results, instant outcomes, success without process. But God never promised speed. He promised harvest. Galatians 6:9 says, "Let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." In due season, not your timing, but the right timing, God's timing, the timing of the process, and that is exactly where most people quit, right before the harvest. So if you're thinking about entering this kind of work, or if you're already in it and considering giving up, hold on to this. The seed you plant today is the provision you will reap tomorrow. Do not abandon the field before the rain comes. Craftsmanship and manufacturing, artisan/creator. Now I want to take you to the second kind of work, and this one is going to touch something you may have never really stopped to think about. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever looked at something handmade, a piece of crafted wood, an embroidered fabric, a piece of furniture built with care, and felt something different, a kind of respect, an admiration that goes beyond the object itself? Do you know why that happens? Because when a human being puts their hands into something and transforms raw material into creation, they are doing something that goes far beyond work. They are reflecting the image of God. Think about that for a moment. The very first act recorded in the Bible is an act of creation. God created, God formed, God shaped, and when He created man, He created him in His own image and likeness. That means that inside every human being, there is a creative capacity that is, at its core, divine. And God didn't leave that in the realm of philosophy. He made it practical. He made it specific. He chose a man by name and revealed to the world what that man was capable of. In Exodus 35:30-35, God speaks about Bezalel. I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with skill, ability, and knowledge in all kinds of crafts, to make artistic designs in gold, silver, and bronze, to cut and set stones, to work in wood, and to engage in all kinds of artistic craftsmanship. Stop. Read that again. God said He filled this man with His own Spirit. To do craftsmanship, to work with his hands, to create with skill and intelligence. This was not a concession. It was not a backup plan. It was an anointing. It was a calling. God anointed an artisan in the same way He anointed prophets and kings. And that changes everything about how you see manual work, because for centuries society has created a false hierarchy. It placed intellectual work above manual work. It placed the executive above the craftsman, the doctor above the carpenter, the entrepreneur above the seamstress. But the Bible does not make that distinction. The Bible honors excellence, regardless of what the hands are doing. Proverbs 22:29 says, Do you see someone skilled in their work? They will serve before kings. They will not serve before obscure men. Skilled, not necessarily educated, not necessarily wealthy, not necessarily famous, skilled. Someone who masters what they do, someone who works with excellence. That is the person who rises. Now let me bring this into practical reality, into today's world, into your life. The market for handmade and artisanal products is exploding worldwide. In the United States, platforms like Etsy generate billions of dollars every year. People selling handmade jewelry, custom clothing, handcrafted furniture, candles, soaps, ceramics, leather goods. And do you know what makes these products worth more than mass-produced ones? The story behind them, the human touch, the time invested, the soul poured into each piece. People are willing to pay more for something that was made with intention, with care, with identity. And here is the trigger that most people don't see. In a world that is becoming more automated every day, what is handmade becomes more rare, and what is rare becomes more valuable. Artificial intelligence can write text, it can generate images, it can automate processes, but it cannot reproduce the perfectly imperfect nature of something made by hand. It cannot put soul into an object. It cannot do what Bezalel did. And that is a massive window of opportunity for anyone who has skill in their hands and hasn't yet realized the value of what they carry. But now I need to tell you something important. Something that goes beyond business. When you create something with your hands, when you turn something simple into something beautiful, when you bring into the world something that did not exist before, you are fulfilling a purpose that was placed inside you before you were even born. Jeremiah 1:5 says, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. God knew Bezalel before Bezalel existed, and He had already placed that skill in him, that gift, that creative capacity. And here is the question that remains. What skill has God placed inside of you that you still haven't had the courage to turn into purpose? Because maybe what you call a hobby is what God calls a calling. Maybe what you call a pastime is what the market is willing to pay for. Maybe what you hide out of fear is exactly what the world needs to see. Bezalel did not hide his gift. He used it, and the result was so extraordinary that it is recorded forever in one of the most read books in human history. And you? What are you going to do with what God has placed in your hands? Fair trade, seller/reseller. Now we come to the third kind of work. And this is the one that creates the most controversy inside the church, the one that divides opinions, the one that makes people uncomfortable, especially those who grew up hearing that money is dirty, that selling is dishonest, that profit is greed. And I need to confront this directly with you today because there is a massive difference between corrupt commerce and righteous commerce. And the Bible doesn't just allow the second, it celebrates it. But before we get there, let me ask you something that might challenge you. If commerce were wrong in the eyes of God, why did Jesus choose disciples who were involved in business? Fishermen who sold fish, Matthew, a tax collector, a man who lived through financial transactions. Why did Jesus himself walk through markets, attend gatherings, and move among places where buying and selling were happening? The answer is simple. Because commerce itself was never the problem. The problem has always been the heart behind the transaction. And that is exactly what the Bible teaches with precise clarity. Proverbs 11:1 says, "A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight." Pay attention to the structure of that verse. God does not condemn the scale. He does not condemn commerce. He does not condemn profit. He condemns dishonesty, manipulation, deception, exploitation, but a just weight, honest trade, transparent transactions. That is what pleases God. That means when you sell with integrity, when you deliver what you promised, when you charge a fair price and treat your customer with respect, you are not just doing business, you are pleasing God. Let that sink in. Now, I want to show you the most powerful example of commerce in the Bible. And interestingly, it's a woman. Proverbs 31 describes what is known as the virtuous woman. And what does she do? She doesn't sit around waiting for prosperity to fall from heaven. She acts, she produces, she negotiates, she buys, she sells. Verse 18 says, she perceives that her merchandise is profitable. And verse 24 continues, she makes linen garments and sells them and supplies sashes to the merchants. This woman is described as virtuous, as worthy of honor, as an example for generations. And she was a businesswoman, a seller, a reseller. The Bible doesn't just accept that. It presents her as a model of excellence. Now, bring this into today's world. Fair trade is probably the most accessible of all the 4 types of work we're talking about. Because you don't need to produce anything. You don't need a specialized skill. You don't need land or tools. You need vision, connection, and integrity. Think about a reseller who buys products from a manufacturer and sells them to the end customer. Think about a drop shipper who connects supplier and buyer without ever touching the product. Think about a real estate agent connecting someone who has with someone who needs. Think about a digital affiliate promoting someone else's product and earning a commission. All of these are modern expressions of the same biblical principle: to connect, to negotiate, and to deliver with justice. In the United States, the resale market moves tens of billions of dollars every year. People buying products on clearance, in thrift stores, at auctions, and reselling them for profit on platforms like eBay, Amazon, and Facebook Marketplace. Starting with less than $100, building real income, consistent income, and the principle behind it is thousands of years old. But here is what separates those who succeed in this field from those who fail. The woman in Proverbs 31 did not sell just anything, in any way. She perceived that her business was good. She evaluated. She discerned. She chose wisely what to sell, who to sell to, and how to sell it. That is what most people lack today when they enter commerce. They sell without strategy, without knowing their customer, without understanding the product, without building relationships. And when it doesn't work, they blame the market, they blame the economy, they blame the system. But Solomon already said in Proverbs 13:4, "The soul of the lazy man desires and has nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made rich." Diligence, that is the word. Not luck, not natural talent, not privileged connections. Diligence, doing what needs to be done, studying the market, understanding the customer, delivering excellence, being honest when something goes wrong, fixing it, improving, persisting. And here is the principle I want you to remember before we move to the final kind of work. Fair trade is not just a business strategy. It is an act of love toward others. Because when you sell something that truly solves a problem, when you deliver real value, when you treat your customer the way you would want to be treated, you are fulfilling the second greatest commandment Jesus gave: love your neighbor as yourself. And your neighbor might be your next customer. Service to others, service provider. Now we've reached the fourth and final kind of work, and I saved this one for the end, not by accident, but because this is the one that has the power to transform not only your business, but your entire life, because the first three kinds of work talk about what you produce, what you create, and what you sell. But this fourth one talks about who you are. And before I introduce this principle, let me ask you the most important question in this entire video. If you had to choose between being the richest man in the cemetery or being the man who impacted the most lives before getting there, which one would you choose? Hold on to your answer, because it will define everything. The fourth biblical business model is service to others, and it is the only one of the four that Jesus didn't just teach, but lived in the flesh, in daily life, in every interaction he had with the people around him. In Mark 10:45, Jesus said something that completely overturned the logic of the world. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Think about the weight of that statement. The Son of God, the Creator of the universe, the one who, with a single word, could have placed everyone at his feet, chose to serve, chose to wash feet, chose to touch lepers, chose to sit with the rejected, chose to go where no one else wanted to go. And this was not an act of weakness. It was the greatest act of leadership in human history. Because Jesus understood something the corporate world took centuries to discover. Those who serve well, lead well. And today, in the 21st century, this principle is being rediscovered under a different name. The biggest companies in the world talk about customer success, customer experience, service culture, and purpose beyond profit. But this is not modern innovation. This is a biblical principle that is 2,000 years old. Now bring this into practical reality. The service industry is the most democratic of all, because every human being has a skill that can serve someone else. Everyone knows how to do something that someone else needs but cannot do themselves. Do you know how to fix computers? That's service. Do you know how to cut hair? That's service. Do you know how to organize spaces? That's service. Do you know how to care for children, the elderly, or animals? That's service. Do you know how to drive, clean, cook, teach, translate, or take photos? All of that is service. And here is the most powerful characteristic of this kind of work. It requires almost no initial financial investment. What it requires is something far more valuable and far more rare in today's world. It requires character, because anyone can offer a service, but very few people actually deliver what they promised, with punctuality, with excellence, with care, and with honesty when something goes wrong. And that is exactly where the opportunity is. in a market full of people who promise a lot and deliver little. Those who deliver more than they promised become unforgettable. Proverbs 17:17 says, "A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity." The service provider who shows up when the client needs it most, who solves problems when no one else wants to, who is present in difficulty, does not just gain a customer. He gains loyalty, he gains referrals, he gains reputation, and reputation, in the kingdom of God and in the marketplace, is worth more than any advertisement. But now I need to pause here and say something beyond all four kinds of work. Because maybe you've watched this entire video expecting a magic formula, a perfect step-by-step, a guaranteed system. And I need to be honest with you. There is no such thing. What exists are principles, and principles only work when they are applied, when they move from theory into practice, when they move from the mind into the hands. Today, you've seen four kinds of work that God established from the beginning of humanity. The farmer, who plants with patience and harvests with faithfulness. The artisan, who creates with skill and honors the gift God placed inside him. The merchant, who connects with integrity and serves with justice. The servant, who leads through service and builds legacy through character. Four paths, four principles, four ways of multiplying what God has already placed in your hands. And they all have something in common. They all require action. Remember the parable of the talents we spoke about in the beginning? The servant who buried his talent didn't lose because of lack of resources. He lost because of lack of movement, lack of courage, lack of decision. And right now, in this very moment, you are standing in front of a choice. You can close this video and go back to the same routine. You can keep waiting for the perfect moment. You can keep burying what God placed in your hands. Or you can decide that today is the day, that enough is enough, that the sign you were waiting for was this video, was this word, was this moment. Joshua 1:9 says, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." God did not promise a path without obstacles. He promised presence on the path. He promised you would not be alone. He promised that the strength you need has already been given. And now the final question. The question that will echo in your mind after this video ends. Which of the four kinds of work did God place on your heart today? Which one stirred something inside you while you were watching? Which one made you think, "This is for me"? Because that movement you felt was not a coincidence. It was direction. The Bible has never been just a book of spiritual promises. It is a manual for life, a guide of principles that work in any era, in any culture, in any economy. Agriculture, craftsmanship, commerce, service, four professions, four callings, four paths that have never failed, because they are built on a foundation that never fails. And that foundation has a name. Matthew 7:24 says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock." On the rock. Not on luck. Not on the economy. Not on circumstances. On eternal principles. And you, from this day forward, already know where those principles are. You already know what to do with them. The only question that remains is, will you act? If this content touched something inside you, if you left here different from how you came in, then I have a simple request for you. Subscribe to this channel, because here we don't create content to fill your time. We create content to transform your life. Content based on real principles, on truths that withstand time, on wisdom that goes far beyond market trends. Click the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this today, because maybe the greatest form of service you can offer right now is to take this message to someone who has been waiting for it without even knowing. See you in the next video, and may God bless every step you take from this day forward.